My son stood at the doorway, pointed toward the garage, and said, "You can sleep there from now on, Dad." There was no shame in his voice, no hesitation. He spoke like a man giving instructions to a stranger. I looked at him, nodded, and quietly walked away. What he did not know was that the house he was pushing me out of did not belong to him. It still belonged to me. And just 1 week later, he would return home to find strangers living inside, and his reaction would change both our lives forever. Before I tell you what happened next, make sure you subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from right now. I love hearing your story too. My name is Henry Lawson, and I am 72 years old. I spent my life working as a school teacher, raising my only son, David, with love, patience, and discipline. My wife, Margaret, passed away 2 years ago after a long illness. Losing her felt like losing the color from my world. The house was too quiet without her, so when David and his wife Tracy suggested that I move in with them, I accepted with gratitude. I believed I was moving into a place of family and comfort. After all, this was the same house Margaret and I had purchased and paid off years ago. When David was struggling financially, I let him live here without rent, because family meant more than money to me. In the beginning, living with them felt peaceful. I woke up early each morning and made breakfast for everyone. I packed my grandson Ethan's school lunch and walked him to the bus stop. He would grab my hand and say, "Grandpa, I like when you live here. You make the house feel alive." Those words brought me joy and gave me purpose again. I kept the garden trimmed, cleaned the porch, and fixed anything broken around the house. I was not just a guest. I was building a home for all of us. But slowly, things began to change. Tracy stopped calling me Dad and began saying Henry in a distant tone. She would sigh when I turned on the television or cooked in the kitchen. She made comments like, "We like things a certain way in this house," as if I were an outsider intruding in someone else's space. David, once warm and affectionate, started acting like he was always in a rush, too busy to talk. He no longer asked how I was doing, or sat with me on the porch like he used to when he was younger. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and heard Tracy speaking on the phone. She didn't know I was nearby. She said, "He needs to stop acting like this is his house. We have our own life now. He is taking up space." The words stung. This was not just any house. This was the home I had built over decades with my wife's laughter in the walls and my son's footprints in the hallway. Yet, here I was, being spoken about like an inconvenience. I tried to stay positive for Ethan. He still ran to me every day after school, excited to show me his drawings and tell me about his friends. He would say, "Grandpa, do you think you'll always live here?" And I would answer, "As long as this is my home, I'll be here." But deep inside, I began to feel that the word home was slipping away, not because I didn't belong, but because I was no longer being treated as family. The moment that changed everything happened on a quiet evening. Tracy complained that I spent too much time in the living room. David stepped forward and said, "It would be better for all of us if you stayed in the garage. It has space, and it keeps everyone comfortable." He said it with the same tone you'd use to talk about moving furniture. No guilt, no concern, just instructions. Ethan gasped and shook his head, tears in his eyes. But David had already made his decision. That night, as I stood in the garage surrounded by tools and storage boxes, I was not angry. I was not even hurt anymore. I stood in silence and remembered the truth. I had never signed this house over. It was still legally mine. I had allowed my son to live here out of love. He had mistaken that love for weakness. That night, I made a promise to myself, not for revenge, but for dignity. What would happen next would teach him a lesson he would never forget. The night I moved into the garage, I stood in the dim light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling and looked at the cot my son had set up for me. The tools on the shelves around me were covered in dust. Boxes were stacked against the wall, and the air smelled of paint thinner and gasoline. It was not a place meant for a person to live, but what hurt more than the cold concrete floor beneath my feet was the memory of the moments that led me here. Just a few hours earlier, I had been sitting in the living room reading the newspaper when Tracy walked in and said I was sitting in the main space too much. She claimed it made guests uncomfortable. David stood beside her, arms folded, eyes emotionless. He said, "Dad, we talked about this. You need to respect that this is our house now. The garage is quieter and gives you privacy." Privacy. That was the word he used to dress up the truth. What he really meant was separation, distance, removal. I looked at his face, searching for the young boy who used to run into my arms. He was scared of thunderstorms, but all I saw was a man who had forgotten his roots. I did not argue. I picked up my pillow and coat, walked toward the garage, and heard the door behind me. That sound did not jump me out of a room, closed me. The life helped build. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the garage door opening. Tracy stepped in with a cup of coffee. For a second, I thought she had come to apologize, but instead placed the cup on a box and said, "Please don't come in the house before 8 a.m. Ethan needs a peaceful morning routine." She left as quickly as she came. Her tone was not angry. It was firm, rehearsed, as if she had been waiting for the opportunity to finally claim control of the house. I stood there, listening to the silence, and realized I had become an unwanted presence in my own home. At breakfast, I sat at the table quietly, while David chatted with Tracy about weekend plans. They spoke as if I were not there. When I tried to join the conversation, Tracy changed the subject. Even the way she placed my plate in front of me felt deliberate, separate, distant, like a server setting a dish for a man she did not want to speak to. Ethan was the only one who still looked at me with love. He slid his hand into mine under the table and whispered, "I don't want you in the garage, Grandpa." I gave his hand a gentle squeeze and told him everything was okay, even though it wasn't. Over the next few days, the tension increased. Tracy started placing limits on what I was allowed to do. One afternoon, she told me not to use the washing machine because it increased the utility bill. The next day, she asked me not to cook because my cooking smell lingered too long. David didn't object. He never raised his voice, but his silence was louder than any argument. Every rule, every restriction, every cold glance chipped away at the bond I thought we had. I could feel my presence shrinking in that home. I was no longer the father who raised him. I was an inconvenience to be managed. Later that week, I overheard David and Tracy talking in the kitchen. Tracy said, "We need to start thinking about a retirement facility. This setup can't last much longer." David replied, "I know. Once we figure out how to talk to him about it, we'll make the transition." The words did not surprise me anymore. I had already seen their hearts turning. What surprised me was how calm I felt hearing them. There was no panic, no anger, only clarity. That clarity is what gave me strength. That evening, Ethan found me in the garage. He sat beside me on the cot and asked, "Are you going to leave?" His voice trembled. I looked into his eyes and saw the one person in that house who still understood the meaning of family. I put my arm around him and said, "Sometimes we have to make hard choices to remind people of what matters." He didn't fully understand, but he nodded, trusting me. At that moment, I made my decision. This was never about them disrespecting. It was about my dignity and teaching my son a lesson he would never forget. I walked into the house and sat at the dining table as David and Tracy prepared to. I looked at them calmly and said, "Thank you for letting me stay in the garage. You've helped me make an important decision. Things are going to change soon." They glanced at each other, confused. Tracy laughed lightly, thinking I was bluffing. David simply shrugged and continued eating. But in my heart, I already knew what they did not. They believed they had finally put me in my place. They had no idea that the place they were standing in, every wall, every room, every key, still belonged to me, and soon they were going to find out. That night, I lay awake in the garage listening to the quiet hum of the water heater and the faint sound of laughter coming from inside the house. That laughter was not filled with warmth. It was distant, almost forced, the kind of laughter people use to distract themselves from the truth. I stared up at the ceiling and reflected on my journey, my years as a father, the sacrifices I had made, the home I had built with my own 2 hands, and the dream I once had of growing old with family by my side. Somewhere along the way, my son had forgotten those truths. He had begun to see the house not as a home built by his father, but as a symbol of his own success and control. Tracy's influence only fueled that pride. They had not pushed me into the garage because they lacked space. They pushed me there because they no longer saw value in my presence. But what they failed to understand was that I was not just a guest in that house. I was the legal owner. Years ago, when David was drowning in debt and on the verge of losing everything, I had stepped in to help. My wife and I had refinanced the property under our names to protect it from being seized by creditors. After my wife passed away, I never removed my name from the deed. I did not mention it because I believed my son would honor the trust I had placed in him. That night in the garage, I accepted that silence no longer served peace. It served disrespect. The next morning, as the sun rose, I got dressed quietly and left the house before anyone else woke up. I walked down the sidewalk with a steady heartbeat and a calm mind. The air was, and for the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my own destiny. I stopped at a bench under an oak tree, took out my phone and called Mr. Walker, my attorney of over 20 years. He answered immediately, surprised to hear from me so early. I explained everything, how I had been moved into the garage, how my son and daughter-in-law had begun treating me like an intruder, how they were planning to send to a facility and take full control of the property. Mr. Walker listened silently, then said, "Henry, you still retain full legal ownership of the home. If you're ready to enforce your rights, we can act immediately. The trust allows you to remove occupants or renegotiate terms at any time." Those words were not just legal empowerment, they were emotional validation. I was not powerless. I had simply chosen not to use my power until now. Mr. Walker scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. When I arrived at his office, he already had the documents laid out. The trust, the deed, and the authority to lease or sell the property were all in my name. I signed the paperwork to list the house for immediate rental occupancy. A respectful family, the Browns, who had been searching for a long-term rental, signed the agreement within 2 days. Every step was done, legally, cleanly, and without a single word of hostility. I did not tell David or Tracy what I had done, because I wanted them to understand the consequences of their choices through experience, not argument. I returned home each evening and continued living quietly in the garage, all while the final arrangements were being completed. No one suspected a thing. On Thursday, I received confirmation that the Browns would be moving in the following Monday. That same day, I booked a comfortable unit in a peaceful senior living community, one I chose willingly, on my own terms, using the rental income that would come from the house. When I arrived home that evening, Tracy greeted me with a forced smile, likely proud she had successfully put the problem in its place. David barely said a word to me. Ethan watched me closely, sensing something had changed, but trusting that whatever it was for the best. That night at dinner, as David spoke about a backyard renovation he was planning, I looked at him and said calmly, "Enjoy this weekend. It will be one you remember." He raised an eyebrow but brushed off the comment. There was no anger in my voice, no malice, just certainty. I had given them every chance to choose respect. They chose pride. Now it was time to show them that the foundation of their pride rested on what was still mine. The turning point had arrived, not with raised voices, but with quiet action that would shift everything they believed to be true. Monday morning arrived quietly. The sky was clear, the air fresh, and the kind of peaceful silence filled the neighborhood that usually signals the start of an ordinary week. But that morning was anything but ordinary. Around 10 a.m., the first moving truck pulled into the driveway. A white SUV followed closely behind, and a family stepped out. Mr. and Mrs. Brown, their teenage daughter, and Mr. Brown's elderly mother. They smiled warmly as they greeted each other, unaware of the storm that was about to break inside the house. I stood calmly at the mailbox, paperwork in hand, as David and Tracy's car turned into the cul-de-sac. They were returning from a weekend trip, cheerful and relaxed, laughing about something that had happened on the road. But the moment they saw the moving truck parked in front of the house, their expressions changed. First confusion, then irritation, and then something far deeper. David slowed the car and leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of strangers carrying boxes through the front door. Tracy sat upright, clutching her purse with a startled gasp. Ethan, sitting in the back seat, looked from the truck to me, his mouth falling open in silent realization. David parked the car hard, the tires screeching slightly against the driveway pavement. He jumped out and marched toward the movers. "Excuse me. You can't just walk in there. This is my house," he said, his voice rising with each word. One of the movers paused, looked at him calmly, and said, "Sir, this home has been legally rented. Here's our contract." David snatched the paper without reading it and turned angrily to me. "Dad, what is going on? Why are these people in our house?" Tracy stepped out of the car, already fuming. She pointed at the Browns and shouted, "This is private property. You need to leave immediately." Mrs. Brown looked confused and turned toward me for guidance. I stepped forward, maintaining complete composure, and said, "Everyone, let's go inside. This will be explained shortly." My voice was calm, not aggressive, and that only made David more unsettled. Inside the living room, boxes labeled master bedroom and kitchenware sat neatly stacked. The place already looked like it was transitioning to a new life. Mr. Walker, my attorney, was seated comfortably on the couch, holding a folder. As David and Tracy stormed in, he stood and greeted them professionally. David demanded answers. "Why is my father's lawyer here? What is this?" Mr. Walker opened the folder. "This is not your house, Mr. Lawson. It is owned solely by your father, who has signed a legal rental agreement with the new tenants. You and your wife no longer have the right to live here." Tracy let out a disbelieving laugh. "That's ridiculous. This is our home. His name isn't on anything." Mr. Walker turned a page and displayed the deed with my name clearly listed as the sole owner. "This house was refinanced under Mr. Lawson's name years ago. Ownership was never transferred to you. You have been occupants, not owners." David's face went pale as the reality hit him. He reached out and grabbed the deed, scanning it frantically. His breathing grew shallow. "Dad, you never told me." His voice trailed off, unable to form the rest of the sentence. Tracy, on the other hand, went from denial to rage. "This is manipulation. You're throwing us out on the street. After all we've done for you?" Her words echoed ironically through the room. I turned to her and said, "You asked me to sleep in the garage because you believed this house belonged to you. You forgot that it was my wife and I who built this home, paid for this home, and allowed you to live here when you had nowhere else to go. You turned my kindness into weakness. Today is not about revenge. It is about truth." David collapsed onto the armchair, his head in his hands. He wasn't angry anymore. He was overwhelmed by reality. Ethan stood frozen near the staircase, tears welling up in his eyes. He looked at his father, then at me, and ran straight into my arms. "Grandpa, where are we going to live?" he asked in a shaking voice. I knelt to his level and held his shoulders gently. "You will go wherever your parents choose, but I will no longer live in a place where I am treated without respect." David stood up suddenly, his voice cracking. "Dad, please. You could have told me. We didn't know." I met his eyes and said softly, "I tried to remind you, not with words, but with my presence. But you stopped listening. You saw the house as yours, and me as a burden. I gave you every chance to make things right. You chose otherwise." Tracy, realizing she had no power left, turned away and began dialing her phone, likely calling a lawyer, but it would not change the truth. Mr. Walker handed David a final notice. "You have 7 days to remove your personal belongings. After that, the residence will be fully transferred to the new tenants. Any attempt to interfere will be considered trespassing." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could ever be. David finally looked at me, not as a man looking at his father, but as someone realizing how deeply he had failed the one person who had given him everything. His voice broke as he whispered, "Dad, I'm sorry." Tears streamed down his face. For the first time in years, I saw humility in his eyes, and it wasn't the house he was losing in that moment. It was his pride. In the days that followed, the energy inside the house shifted from one of silent hostility to a heavy, undeniable awareness of reality. There were no more raised voices, no more rules about where I could sit, or when I was allowed to come inside. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance that life had changed, and it had changed because of choices that were made willingly. David walked through the house slowly each morning, not with ownership, but with reflection. I often found him in the living room where he once told me not to use the television, now sitting silently on the couch with his head down, as if the weight of his decisions had finally found its home in his conscience. Tracy was no longer proud or irritated. She moved cautiously, speaking in a softer voice, no longer issuing commands. The new tenants were kind and respectful, and they included me in conversations when we crossed paths. They greeted me warmly each day, asking how I was and if I needed help with anything. Their kindness made it clear. Respect comes not from titles, not from family blood alone, but from the character of the heart. On the third day, as I was loading the last box of my belongings into Mr. Walker's car, David approached me. There was no anger, no defensiveness, only humility. "Dad," he said quietly, "I never thought we'd end up here. I was blinded by wanting control. I forgot what you've done for us. I forgot who you are." His voice trembled, and for a moment, I saw the young boy he once was, the one who held my hand tightly on his first day of school, afraid to let go. I placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "You didn't lose this house, David. You lost your way. And when a man loses his way, the first step is not getting something back, it is getting himself back." Tracy stood nearby, tears in her eyes. She finally spoke the words she had never said before. "We hurt you. We made you feel unwanted in a home you built. I was wrong." Ethan ran up to me and hugged me tightly around the waist. "Grandpa, can I still visit you?" he asked, his voice shaking. I knelt down and held his face gently. "Of course you can, son. A house might have an address, but love doesn't. Love lives where people choose to treat each other with kindness." His eyes filled with hope, and in that moment, I knew that the future wasn't lost. It was being rewritten with truth. As I settled into my new residence, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not the quiet that comes from silence, but the peace that comes from living with dignity. For the first time in a long time, I woke up in a place where my worth was not questioned, where I was greeted with smiles, where people spoke to me with respect, not because they were obligated to, but because they chose to. My new home was simple, but it was filled with warmth. The staff greeted me each morning. Neighbors invited me to join community gatherings, and I found myself laughing more than I had in years. David and Ethan began visiting me every weekend. They brought board games, photos, and stories from their week. Tracy joined them quietly, no longer carrying the aura of superiority, but of someone who had learned the cost of pride. Over time, she began helping at my new community center, serving meals to elders. I watched her grow, not in status, but in heart. One Sunday afternoon, as we sat in the garden area surrounded by blooming flowers, David turned to me and said, "Dad, you didn't just take the house back. You gave us a chance to remember what matters." I nodded and replied, "Sometimes in life, we don't lose what we have. We lose our gratitude for it. When gratitude leaves, everything else follows." Ethan smiled and said, "Grandpa, I'm glad you didn't let people treat you like that. You taught me something important." I looked into his eyes, filled with sincerity far beyond his years, and knew that everything I did was not to punish anyone, but to protect the truth of what a family should be. The story did not end with eviction or victory. It ended with awakening. My son did not lose a house. He lost his pride, and from that loss, he found humility. And in that humility, he found his way back to me. The house is now a place where another family builds memories, while I enjoy a peaceful life surrounded by people who value me. I did not choose revenge. I chose dignity, and that choice changed everything. The important lesson is simple. Never stay silent when your dignity is at stake. A roof over your head means nothing if the people under it refuse to show you respect. A home is not defined by walls. It is defined by the love and honor shared within them. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of the value of family and respect, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences.